Welcome everyone today to our webinar, The Color of Philanthropy, Southern Leaders' National Potential, hosted by the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, ABFI, the Southeastern Council on Foundations, and Grantmakers for Southern Progress. We're thrilled to have you join us for this timely and rich conversation. My name is Sarah Duffy, and I'm Senior Associate for Learning and Engagement here at NCRP, where I help coordinate our webinar conversations. And I'm excited to have co-designed this webinar with my good friend, Edward Jones from ABFI, who I'll turn it over to introduce himself and say a little bit about ABFI.
Yes, good morning or afternoon, depending on where everyone is. My name is Edward Jones, Director of Programs for ABFI, a philanthropic partnership for Black communities. And I'm pleased to be on this with our Change Philanthropy partner, NCRP, as well as the other great folks in the Southeastern Council, part of the Southeastern Council, as well as Grantmakers for Southern Progress on this work. And I'm thinking about how we came to have this conversation following the Grantmakers for Southern Progress meeting in a shared car service on the need for us to do some follow-up conversations around this this important topic. And so it's great to be here as ABFI's work is focused on engaging and getting funders to be very thoughtful around their support to Black-led work in Black communities and throughout the nation. It's really an important conversation to have, given the demographics of the southern and southeastern parts of our country includes a considerable number of Black, Afro members of the diaspora. So this conversation is really important to us, particularly as we think about even our work around making the case for Black-led social change and support through philanthropy. So it's just great to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation with some great folks that you all are about to meet. Thank you. Take it away, Caitlin.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you. Great. As many of you know, this webinar is part of a joint campaign between NCRP and Grantmakers for Southern Progress called As the South Grows. The goal of this campaign, which will feature reports, webinars like this one, conference presentations, and other content, is to attract more philanthropic support to work that leads to equity and systemic change in the South. The first report is what will be a series of 4. First was released in April, and we encourage you to check it out on our website. We'll definitely share a link to that in the follow-up email to you all after this webinar. It explores some of the work to build power among marginalized communities in the South with a focus on the Alabama Black Belt and the Mississippi Delta. You'll find it on our website, and as I mentioned, follow-up email after this webinar. And we want to hear from you about this research, so please get in touch with any questions or reactions that this report gives up for you. And be sure to stay tuned for the next installment in the As the South Grows series, which will be out this month on June 26th. We'll be very excited to share that with you. So before we get started, I want to give you all a snapshot of who's joining us on the call today and what kind of organizations we have represented. So first, you'll see here the largest group we have represented are nonprofits, which includes some philanthropy support organizations. Next up, we have bunch of other academia, consultants, and social enterprises, catch-all for everyone else. We also have a number of private independent foundations, family foundations, and community foundation folks on the call today. We also asked those of you who registered to tell us which area of the country your organization primarily serves. By far, the most folks serve nationally here in the U.S., but closely followed by work in the Southeast. You'll all see the breakdown of the other areas served above that. For today's conversation, you'll get to hear from a little bit of context for what we'll be discussing from our moderator. We'll do a brief attendee poll to get a sense of the work that you all are doing. Then you'll get to meet all of our amazing panelists. And we'll hear from them in a moderated discussion, after which you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of them and further that discussion. After that, they'll close us out with some of their thoughts and calls to action. And throughout this conversation, we encourage you to join us on social media, particularly using the hashtag #FindSouth and the hashtag #AsTheSouthGrows. You can also tweet at NCRP and at ABFI. I also shared the handles for SEF, which is SEF Tweets, and Grantmakers for Southern Progress, which is Southern Grant. So we look forward to engaging with you there. You'll see on the bottom of most slides, I have listed out these hashtags and handles for your easy reference. And today I am so honored to have these 4 featured speakers with us. The first is Ms. Felicia Lucky, who is Executive Director of the Black Belt Community Foundation. We also have Fernando Cuevas, Executive Director of the Southern Partners Fund. Flozell Daniels Jr., President and CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana, and Ms. Karen Watson, Executive Director of the Positive Action Committee. If to read more about our featured speakers today, please go to the event page on NCRP's website, which features the speakers' full bios. Now I will turn it over to our moderator, Takima Robinson, who serves as Senior Principal and CEO of Converge Consulting, also as Director of the Greater New Orleans Funders Network. Thank you so much, Takima, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin, so much. And thank you again, both to NCRP and APFI for having me here today. So I'm excited about this topic. We're going to talk today about the color of philanthropy. I think a very provocative topic at this time in our country. And so before we begin, I just want to say a little bit about how we're defining and talking about what people of color-led philanthropy is. And very specifically, we are talking about Black and brown folks in leadership positions in philanthropy. We're talking about people of color who are CEOs, who are serving on boards, and are in leadership roles, programmatic leadership roles. And so our fields of philanthropy has been having a decades-long conversation about why it's important that people of color are leading in this work. I know NCRP, APFI, other members of the Chain Philanthropy family have been really doing this work for a long time. I myself am an APFI fellow and really was able to learn so much and sharpen my own racial equity analysis to really broaden my leadership in this field. But in this day and age, as the field begins to turn to the South, and we all know the history of this region, I think it's even more important that we have this discussion about how and where we are leading as people of color in this field. So given what we know collectively about the South and my own experience in this region as a leader for the past 10 years, I think it truly makes a difference to have faces like mine and those you're going to hear from today in the boardrooms really advocating on behalf of communities of color across the region. These are leaders who bring a rich racial justice analysis to their grant making, but also who are accessible to the communities who are leading the work on the ground. So that's a bit of context for where we're going to begin this conversation. And before we dive in, we really want to do a bit of an audience poll. We want to know who you are. And so on your screen in just a second, you will see a poll for you to participate and help ground this conversation. All right. So you should see, does your organization partner with people of color-led philanthropy in the South? If you can just take a quick second to answer that question, and let's see who we have here. All right. So we have 62% of you at this point who are saying, yes, we have partners in the region. So that's excellent. We have 22% who are saying, no, we do not. 14, not yet. So we're looking forward to engaging those of you who are yet to partner with people of color who are leading philanthropic efforts in the South. And hopefully this conversation will sort of inform how you may go about doing that. So with that, I really want to begin to turn it over to our panelists and learn more about who we have on the call. I'm going to begin with Felicia Lucky from the Black Belt Community Foundation.
Thank you.
Hey,
Good. Hello there.
Hey, so tell us a few things that you want the audience to know about you and your work at the Black Belt Community Foundation.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to be here, so I'd like to say thank you all so much for having me. It's an awesome task to share our stories, and I think a very long-awaited conversation that needs to be had, so we're glad to be a part. The Black Belt Community Foundation is located in Selma, Alabama, and we serve 12 counties throughout the state. And those counties pretty much go horizontally across the county, similarly to a belt. And within those 12 counties are pretty much 12 of the most economically challenged counties in the state. And oftentimes they've been disconnected from resources and other programs that the state has had to offer. But much of the work that we do relies completely on our community. So one of the things that I hope that you know, and you will see it woven throughout each of my comments, is that community leads, and we've not always relied on states or other funding from from outside, but we've always taken what we've had inside to make what we needed.
Thank you, Felicia. Thank you. Fernando. Fernando is the Executive Director again at the Southern Partners Fund. Can you talk to us a little bit about the work of Southern Partners Fund and share with us a little bit about what you want the audience to know about the work that you're doing?
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today and actually have the opportunity to really talk a little about the work that we do and who we are. I mean, the thing, to really get a good sense, I just want to also mention that Southern Partners Fund is a nonprofit foundation that's actually governed by community, and 90% of our membership, being a membership-based foundation, are people that could come from community of color. And they're the ones that govern and move the work of the foundation, for which we do fund in 12 states across the region in the Southeast. And we fund grassroots community organizing in the rural South as a part of it. We only focus in the rural areas of the South in our funding. And as a part of it, we'll actually be celebrating our 20th year anniversary next year, which is exciting for us because being, a community foundation that's led by grassroots community organizers from that, I mean, I think it's a great success being to the point to where we're going to be reaching our 20th year next year. And actually in that time frame, we've been able to leverage about $8.5 million in giving to communities across the rural South of the region. So it's exciting.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you so much for that work. Karen, I'm going to ask you to answer that same question. So Karen Watson, again, Executive Director of Positive Action Committee. Can you talk a little bit about the work of the committee, of the Positive Action Committee, and tell us a little bit about what you want folks to know about you and your leadership in the South?
The Positive Action Committee is located in Scriven County, Sylvania, Georgia being the seat. We are a rural community that is a mixture of agriculture and some industry. We typify what rural Southern communities look like, particularly in very institutionalized power structures that have traditionally been racially exclusive. And so the organizing that PAC does goes to the heart of what civil rights and social justice is about. And the other thing that I think it's really important to understand about me is that when you see Southern Partners Fund as a foundation, you are looking at a combination of other rural organizations, just like the Positive Action Committee, who were supported first by the Burton Mary Meyer Foundation and then sustained and had that leadership nurtured and grown by Southern Partners Fund. And so because of that, you have people sitting in the foundation who wear dual hats. We are still organizers on the ground, in the trenches, against the very basic social justice issues, and at the same time, we are still funders and philanthropists.
Thank you, Karen. I think that piece is really going to be important in our conversation, because I think many of us play that role, not just in our philanthropy seat, but we also are folks who are also organizing in our communities as well. So speaking of someone who organizes in the community outside of his role as CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana, Flozell, can you talk a little bit about the work of FFL in your leadership in community as well?
Great, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be on the call with such an esteemed group of leaders, and I appreciate NCRP and AFBI's leadership in pulling us together. The Foundation for Louisiana is a statewide social justice foundation. We are a grant-making public charity and intermediary, and we get a chance through a racial equity lens to invest in people and practices that work to really uplift and strengthen communities. And we do that work by working with community by way of leadership development, by way of public policy practice, and community development finance, making low interest loans, and of course, mission critical granting financing to make sure that we can achieve a racial equity agenda. You know, the board hired me actually in a very intentional move that I think is important for this discussion. They said they wanted a person of color who is from this community to be responsible for leading this work and all of the benefits that that brings, as the As the South Goes report talks about. And that's been really critical. I come from a policy background, and so much of the work that we've been able to do has been by way of leadership and community wisdom from the communities that we're privileged to work with to really elevate these issues: criminal justice reform, housing, access to jobs, access to democracy and freedom, in ways that really helped us build on some of the progress we've made. And there is, of course, much work to do. We also have been intentional about being both a local partner, but a regional and national partner. I am a founding co-chair of Grantmakers for Southern Progress, members of my staff, people of color who serve on the Southeastern Council on Foundations. There's some intentionality around being in partnership so that we can make sure that the South is getting the attention it rightly deserves because of the progress that it's making and because of the ripe opportunity to invest in the American South. Thank
you, Flozell. I'm also going to ask you to talk a little bit about the Greater New Orleans Funders Network, which I know you and I work on together. But talk a little bit about that work, because I think it also speaks to the leadership and how folks are beginning to work both strategically with national partners. You know, there's a great story to tell. If you look back at the As the South Goes report, the original report, and even Words Matter, the addendum, there was some direction that we learned in there. That told us we needed to build stronger infrastructure in the American South and in southern regions to make sure that we can achieve the justice outcomes that we wanted to achieve. One of the things that we took from that lesson and what we learned is the creation of the Greater New Orleans Funders Network. It might surprise some people that New Orleans, as much attention as it had received pre and post Katrina, did not have a regional area grantmakers association or something that was a portal and a place for people who care about mission critical philanthropy, and in particular having a racial equity and a justice orientation. We didn't have a table, and so we came together with both national and local funders. We used some of the framework from As the South Goes and the Words Matter piece to really think about how we build relationships, how we navigate some of the issues between national and local funders, how we recharge the relationship we have with our grantee partners and other partners across the community. And out of that exercise came the Greater New Orleans Funders Network, which has been, I think, by my estimation, a great success already. We were able to not only very intentionally bring on talent like Takima and others, but to really advance this work to set action tables that allow us to deliver on the promise of what it means for communities to be made better. One example, as you can see here, is recently the Criminal Justice Action Table, one of
5 now action tables, including an equitable development, a coastal action table, and a youth and education table, and a more recent boys and men of color table. The criminal justice action table worked very closely with its grantee partners on the ground, with the public sector, with private sector leaders, and across the gamut of folks who were working on criminal justice reform. And over more than 6 months, we were able, through a surge funding strategy and a partnership and communication strategy, to help the Louisiana legislature achieve historic legislation to reduce the number of people incarcerated in our state prisons and to create more investment, hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, so that we can actually invest in people's lives. And so the Funders Network was a mission critical part of that work. And we're hoping to continue that kind of success.
Thank you. And that definitely helps to exemplify the conversation we're having today about the role that people of color play as philanthropic leaders and who are also organizing in this work. So with that, I really want to spend some time having a conversation. And so you all have really helped get us grounded. So I want to go back to you, Felicia, and talk a little bit about what's different about doing racial justice work in the South? And what do other funders who are not in the South need to know about what's different about doing racial justice work here in the South?
Well, I think in short, just that it looks and it feels very different than work probably anywhere else. And that look and feel is different because the region that we serve is different. Our way of operating, our way of doing business, and even sometimes the outcomes that we are working so diligently for, they look different than the outcomes that are discussed or evaluated elsewhere. And I think the work itself requires a deep, deep connection to community, unlike other areas. So you have to be deeply ingrained in the community. You have to have your ear on the ground. You've got to be in the community and not necessarily behind a desk. And that requires most times a lot of travel into the communities or funding so that staff members can get into the community, funding for others who've got to travel from one place to another. And most funders are not excited about high travel budgets. But if you live in a rural community and you're trying to make an impact in the community with community, it's something that's very necessary. So I just think that the look and feel of it is different. It still produces an awesome outcome, but it just doesn't look like what traditional outcomes look like.
Thank you, Felicia. Fernando, I want to ask you the same question. So talk a little bit about racial justice work in the South, and if you could even illuminate that and give some examples of some of the great work that you guys are doing at the Southern Partners Fund to advance racial justice work, and talk a little bit about what that looks and feels like in the region.
Well, I mean, as a key part of the vision for Southern Partners Fund, well, the mission is to support community organizing for social justice in the Rural South, while increasing their financial resources for the local organizing that's taking place. I think that's a big key piece of it. And also SPF believes that there must be equity in its leadership. And that means that, the Rural South needs leaders who are part of the communities they serve, carrying out those strategies that are developed by community themselves. And I think that's really what makes SPF, different than what your typical philanthropic institution, given that our governing body, our whole makeup of Southern Partners Fund comes from community. They're engaged directly in the work that's taking place on ground, and they're the ones that move the work of the foundation. And having that as part of the operation of Southern Partners Fund, I think is really what gives us the advantage of really being able to address and be able to react to the issues that rural communities are facing across the 12 states that we fund in. And I mean, and without that, I mean, it's not just us being in community, it's being part of the community that's taking place in the work that's really moving forward. And even in part of it, I mean, and then as you're dealing and working within the rural South, I mean, I think the dynamics is totally different, not just in other regions of the country, but even in the urban areas of the Southeast. I think it's very different, when you're really facing and talking about the rural South as a part of it, and the faces and the challenges that they faced in their organizing work. And I think that's one of the things that funders really need to understand that when you're having to live in the communities where you're starting these fires, it's totally different than working in other parts. And, you know, when you're working in these larger cities, when you're in a real small rural community and you're living in the fire that you're starting, I mean, it just makes it that much more challenging.
Yes, because folks will see you at the grocery store. They will see you at church on Sunday. It is very real. We are there's a different level of accountability. I actually want to ask Karen for you to talk a little bit and pick up on this piece that Fernando was discussing around the rural South. So talk a little bit about doing racial justice work in the rural South. Karen, can you speak to that a little bit for us?
Okay, well, let me just say, let me raise what is a very unpopular topic among funders. And because of that, organizers don't really talk about it either. So let me just say from personal experience and also from experience with the other organizations we work with, retaliation is real. When you start talking about starting these fires that Fernando is referencing, and you live in those communities, your family is there, they work there, their children go to school there, the retaliation from starting those fires is a reality. And it did not start with any kind of present administration. It has been there all along. It may be heightened now, but it's been there all along. And so the retaliation can be physical, it can be financial, it can be with your dealings at the bank, it can be with your husband or your wife who, you know, works at the local plant or one of the local plants. And probably if you are starting a fire with your board of commissioners or your board of education or anyone in that community, the chances are somebody in your family either works for or under a family member of that person. Mm-hmm. And when we start these fires, they don't just say, oh, you're right, we are wrong about that. Let us stop doing that. No, you risk your family members losing their jobs. You risk your financial well-being at whatever institution you may be banking at. You risk retaliation against your children because they're in that school system that you're taking on. So one of the things about organizing in the rural South is that it is rural, it is isolated, and that makes the retaliation even more real and even more difficult to deal with. That's one thing I'd like for funders to know. The other thing I'd like for them to know is that even though we saw all the issues of racism and gender bias and all of that all across the country, it is a historical fact that the South was and remains a gatekeeper for that kind of behavior. Mm-hmm. And that's not just my opinion. Look at how much regressive policy is being led in this country by Southern politicians. Look at their access to the present administration. There are 3 or 4 of them up there really close around him. There's a reason why when people get ready to be regressive, they go and get Southern politicians. And very often the policies that we find ourselves organizing against, because I put all of us in the same group if we're fighting for justice, the very policies that urban organizers find themselves organizing against were policies that were started in the rural South. And because the rural South remains underfunded, there was not enough organizing to stop the policy when it started in the rural South. So then it spread across the state, the region, and eventually became some aspect of national policy. So funders need to understand that as long as we keep underfunding the South, it will keep birthing this kind of behavior that will spread nationwide. And I'd also like for funders to understand, because of the characteristics of the South, we should be very realistic about what we expect community organizations to be able to accomplish in a given time frame. And I think to some extent, some of the reasons funders pulled out of the South, many of them, was because they figured, well, we've been funding the South for years and it doesn't appear to be making much progress. But the truth of the matter is, it's not realistic to expect a handful of organizations to undo in 30 or 40 years what the federal government instituted and protected for 400.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. And thank you for keeping it real and really helping us get to the heart of the matter. Flozell, I hear you piping up, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to question as well, because I also know that this issue around retaliation for the work that you all have stepped up to do at the Foundation for Louisiana has been real, and that there is a different level of risk, which is what Karen is talking about, a different kind of risk that people of color who lead progressive philanthropy in the South are exposed to. So I want you to talk a little bit about the work that you guys do at FFL and really how you all have mitigated some of those risks.
Sure. I was just sitting here kind of having an amen moment, listening to Karen give this masterclass, really, on these experiences that we've had. And one of the things we've been saying to people, and we don't want to be in politics, but the truth is these are issues that we've been navigating in the South forever. And for some parts of the country, and in some communities even in the South, it's new to people. The fact is we've been dealing with this kind of risk and power analysis, this kind of economic terrorism and personal endangerment that has been part and parcel of the Southern strategy for as long as we can remember, and it is now being grown and expanded. And so much of the opportunity, I think, as we talk about this conversation about the importance of person of color-led philanthropy and the opportunity for us to work better together, really is grounded in these experiences that we have, our understanding of the nuanced multiple languages, if you will, that get spoken in and through communities that allow us to translate strategies that are much more likely to work and that are much more likely to get the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. I think there's something really powerful about the point that Karen made, in particular about rural versus urban, if I could use that phrase. Because we work statewide, we see what has been a very intentional set of strategies by powerful interest in pitting rural communities against urban communities and vice versa. And so it's part of this work that we've been doing at Foundation for Louisiana, and it's a practice. It will take us a generation to begin to see some of the outcomes that we want, is to really be able to match communities, to be able to talk across lines, urban and rural and suburban and exurban, so that people can see the commonalities they have. So they can see, for instance, how powerful state level policies are in impacting local communities. We see a swath of preemptive legislation and other actions taken by people in one part of the state that are meant to diminish other people's in the state. And so part of what we've been working on and will continue to push for is regional approaches to state level policy and creating policy partnerships at every level, from grassroots organizing to policy advocacy to the research and data discussions, all of it deeply grounded in a racial equity lens or interracial equity lens, and making sure that people of color are leading that work across the breadth of the spectrum.
Thank you, Flozell. So to everybody out there in audience land, I want to make sure that you all begin to engage this conversation. At the bottom of your screen, you should find a Q&A box. You can start submitting questions, and I'm going to continue to ask a few more questions of our panelists, but I invite you now to find that Q&A box and begin to jump into the discussion. We're going to pivot to your questions in about 10 or 15 minutes. So with that, I want to come back and talk a little bit about our working with our national funding partners. You know, the work that Grant Makers for Southern Progress is doing has been really, really important to raise the profile of the South. I know that I have never seen this much interest in national foundations in sort of trying to better understand the South and how to insert and support work in the South than I am seeing now. And I think it gets back to some of the things that you said, Karen, around how we're all having this realization that if we don't head some of the stuff off that's being developed in the rural South that the rest of the country, as the South goes, right, the rest of the country will have to endure some of these bad policies. So let's talk a little bit about working with national funding partners and how do we begin to operationalize their interest in the South and begin to position Southern grant makers not as grantees, but as real partners. So the first person I want to pitch that question to is you, Fernando. How do we begin to work more strategically with our national colleagues and really begin to position local, regional, Southern foundations as partners and not as grantees?
Well, I think one of the big things is we're starting conversations with national funders who don't have the method of working within the South or have that interest of engaging in the South. I think is looking at how can national funders start having communication and dialogue with community in the South. I think that's the first big step is, having and being and creating a communication structure of not just national funders coming in with their own agenda, but really coming in and talking and speaking with community to be able to build the dialogue that's really going to be needed to be effective in making change, here in the South. And I think that's the first step in looking at it. And also helping funders build a bridge between funding urban and rural. Because there's a lot of funders that have an interest of funding in the South, but there's really not a lot of talk of funding in the rural South. And it could be that some national funders don't have the capacity of funding those rural organizations with the smaller budgets, but there are vehicles set in place, like Southern Partners Fund and others that can be that vehicle of getting resources to the rural South. And I think that's going to be another key piece of really building a strong partnership as a part of it and moving forward.
Thank you. Flozell, can you also take on that question? Talk a little bit about operationalizing our relationship with national partners.
I think part of what's been critical about our experience with that is beginning to open the discussion up a bit with national funders and really talking about, and again, I go back to the As the South Goes report and the progress that I think I've seen some organizations like Foundation for Louisiana make, is being able to have those discussions, get in a fishbowl kind of situation and say to funders, even if you as an organization are just beginning to approach this racial equity work, even if you as a large national funder have not yet sorted through what a Southern practice looks like. I think Karen's comments earlier were germane to this. It's different working in the South and it's different working in urban versus rural in the South. We not only have to acknowledge those things, but what's really critical for national funders is to be able to find mission critical intermediary partners or regional grant making partners who can help them take that work on and not just become a grantee, as you put it, but to be a real partner in the strategy map. Those partners have to show up in the strategy map so we can talk about and really lay out accountability for how we get the outcomes that we're looking for. Too often, we treat the relationship as one where it's, well, this is another grantee, they're going to check the boxes and do that work. I think as the report, the newest report indicates, we really have to get the general operating support. We have to be in partnership with people, developing strategies together, doing the kind of analysis, using the same kind of data and reporting so that we can develop those outcomes.
Thank you, Flozell. Felicia, I know you've been beginning to work quite a bit with national partners. Talk a little bit about what that work looks like and how you are positioning the Black Belt Community Foundation as a partner in those relationships with national funding partners.
Definitely. And before I do that, I did want to go, because I think one of the comments Flozell made earlier about sometimes the urban versus rural challenges. I also wanted to say that there sometimes within rural communities, there are rural versus rural issues that you have to raise to the table as well. So I just didn't want to miss that. But a lot of what we've seen, or the small shift that we've seen over the last couple of years in our work with national funders, has been kind of made up of about three different things. One is that we've worked really diligently to help funders acknowledge what we bring to the table as far as our connection and community, acknowledging that we are an existing organization that has a track record in the community, that we have a network of individuals that we've worked with who are ready to mobilize at any moment, and that's a great gift that we bring. And in not just being a grantee, but a partner in designing the work that needs to be done, as well as actually implementing some of the work. And one piece that I think we still have struggled with a bit is a long-term approach or a long-term investment in the work that's taking place, because so oftentimes it's very short-lived. By many national funders, it's very quick. You know, it's not likely that we're going to change the state of the Black Belt in 3 years, you know, and sadly enough, not even in 5 years, but it does help to have that consistent funding and a long-term commitment to actually seeing change take place. And I will say that we are hoping as we continue to move forward that we will be able to build on what's been learned from the greater New Orleans Funders Network, as well as Appalachia Funders Network, and help to craft a Black Belt Funders Network. And as we've lifted up the Grant Makers for Southern Progress, they've played an instrumental role in making sure those connections can be made. And I think that's a very critical point to national funders. And as Flozell mentioned, the necessity of intermediaries along the way. Most times in a lot of our communities, going through an intermediary is the most effective way to actually affect change at the local level. And recognizing and acknowledging and valuing that, I think, leaves a lot on the table to be done.
Thank you, Felicia. I think I'm going to swing back to this question about the roles intermediaries play in the South. But Karen, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about your work with national funding partners, and what does that work look like, and how are you positioning Positive Action Committee as a partner instead of a grantee? We know there's a power dynamic, and so how are you really positioning your work in partnership with national foundations who want to invest, and not as a grantee?
Thank you. Because we work on a local level as far as positive action is concerned, and we work on state levels and across the region. And then when I'm with SPF, of course, we are working in a 12-state area. So I can speak from what PAC is doing in that arena, and also what SPF is trying to help other organizations do. One of the things that I want to talk about when we talk about trying to make this a partnership instead of just a grantor-grantee relationship, I think the key to this is making sure from the very beginning that funders, national funders, understand what it is you are asking them to fund. Now, when I say that, I don't mean if they fund education, then you just write, you know, the grantee organization just writes a proposal that would fit under an education agenda, and then go to these funders and they fund it. Because all education proposals in the rural South are not going to look alike. And they probably are not going to fit that graph that the funder laid out. So it's important that the funder, number one, understand if they're willing to fund education, then you need to be willing to fund justice in education from a lot of different perspectives. Because what one community is working on, the other community may not be working on, but they both may be very vital to the issue. So I think they need funders. We have to make sure funders understand this is what we are going to do specifically. These are the problems we've identified. These are the strategies we're going to embark on. And you need to know that only fund this if you are willing to sign up for our decisions around it. Because we're the ones in the community, we know what's going on, and we know how we need to be working. And I think that may sound like something simple, but it's really not, because what we've seen with national funders is somebody very well-intentioned, somebody or somebodies sit around and determine what the problems are that they see, in a specific funding area. And then they decide we're going to fund work that looks like this. And then organizations who are doing work in that area that may not necessarily fit that particular mode will write a proposal to try and work themselves into that mode because they desperately need the funding to keep doing the work. However, they still cannot fully do the work they know they need to do because the proposal wasn't written based on their work. It was written based on what this funder said they would fund. So in trying to create a partnership, it is just that. It is I believe in you, you believe in me, we're going to be in this together. If I'm just trying to do as an organization what some funder has decided they will fund, there's no way you're going to get to a partnership from that dynamic. The path to do that just is not there. And so what I would like to see is a roundtable of national funders who are willing to bring together community organizations who are working in these fields and sit down and say, what is it you all need from us to help you accomplish what you are trying to accomplish? Because that's what needs to drive national funding, not what somebody who doesn't even know the work has decided is the work.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Karen.
And can I just say one more thing too about the financial part of this that, you know, Felicia and others spoke so well about. The other thing around the finances, we as national funders, we need to engage in an aggressive dialogue that says to people, it is very condescending to go to the rural South and ask people to do $200,000 worth of work for $30,000. That is just unrealistic. And I think it reflects a kind of social injustice that happens in society all of the time, that if we are working for justice, we do not need to be imitating that mode. And it's that mode where the soldiers in the trenches are making less than the commanders who are shuffling the papers.
Thank you, Karen, so much for that. So you started to speak to this piece around building relationships, which I think we all know here in the South is important. And all of you on this phone come from organizing traditions, and you know that building relationships as organizers is really key to getting work done. So I want to talk a little bit about relationship building in the South and how that is different. And what are some do's and don'ts for folks who want to invest here? So Fernando, can you talk a little bit about relationship building and talk a little bit about what that looks like in the work that you all do at Southern Partners Fund?
Well, I think part of the bigger piece is, I mean, it goes back to what we're talking about, grantees versus partners. And that's one of the things that we've always done as a foundation with the organizations that we support. We consider them partners within the region, partners within the social justice movement, and building that history and that partnership with the grantees that we've been funding. I think has been very key to being more effective in the work that we're doing and the funding that's taking place within the region. And on top of that, that partnership, even within the Southern Partners Fund, is really what led SPF to building the Southern Organizing Strategy, which is where we're focusing 60% of our grant-making dollars around immigration reform, education reform, and voter engagement. Again, throughout that partnership, it was established through the partnership that was built within our grantees across the region that guided that work of the foundation. But without that, and also through that, it's also helped us develop, which is our Social Justice Institute, which helps builds that line of communication to really respond to the needs and building the capacity and the leadership of grantees and organizations across the region, and really building a network of consultants and educators that are part of the Institute that help work peer-to-peer amongst grantees and amongst organizations across the region that build that relationship and build that strength in the network of the work that's taking place. So it's not just the dollars that are given two organizations to do the work, but it's really helping strengthening and building networks and collaborations amongst the organizations, not just across city lines, county lines, state lines, but across the region as a whole, as a part of it. So the partnership is something that's really embedded in the work that Southern Partners Fund does, and that's really what guides and strengthens all of that work as a whole.
Thank you, Fernando. I like to talk or think about relationship building in the South as go slow to go fast. And so, Felicia, talk a little bit about relationship building as a cornerstone of the work that you all do in the Black Belt.
Sure. The history of the Black Belt Community Foundation was actually created from the need and from community. And that was from day one in involving community and all that we were doing. Very critical to our founding, very critical to our continued existence, to be honest. And that was because for our region of the state, for so long we had had others who had not done work in this region, who had not valued what the community had to bring to the table. So our being created was to make sure that we appreciated the value that existed and that we invested in the value. So we didn't just say we appreciate the work that you're doing, but we're investing in the work that you're doing the way that you want it to be done and the way you think it needs to be done, not the way we think it should be done. But we knew going into it, we had to invest strongly in community. And I say invest strongly so much so that when I bought a car that had 8 miles on it, at the end of 2 years, I had over 80,000 miles on it. So that was a huge investment of time and talent and treasure, but it was very necessary so that others would believe and would find our organization to be credible and that they would see us as being a part of them and who they were. And this isn't starting an organization from scratch where the majority of our community members were not familiar with community foundations because there was not one that was previously serving our area. So we had to make that type of investment of time into the community. And it's definitely yielded us great benefits because what's happened at the end of the day is that this foundation doesn't just belong to Felicia or its board of directors, but this foundation truly belongs to all the residents of the Black Belt. So much so that there's an investment, whether it's a $5 a month investment or $100 a month investment by a retired school teacher, that type of investment is there, but it could not have been done if those relationships weren't there. And for other types of programming that we've done, we invest very heavily in our community associate or volunteer program, which are grassroots leaders across the region. We invest in them in providing the skills and tools so that they can be effective leaders, not just for our organization, but for the region as well. I could talk on and on about that because I know that we wouldn't even have a place on the map if it were not for the relationships that were created in our communities. And those relationships are what they help us stand tall on a daily basis.
Thank you, Felicia. I think you really underscore the idea that in the South, relationships are sustainability. So it is without our relationships it's with our relationships that we get to do this work. So I want to start pivoting to our audience questions. Do any of you all want to answer that last question around relationships before we go to some of the questions that are pouring in from our audience? Karen, Flozell, do you guys want to jump in on the relationship building question?
I think I had something to say, but quite honestly, I think Felicia really covered the issues. I would probably only add that part of what we're really trying to make sure that we stay focused on is there's some element of truth telling and relationship building that is based in a healing relationship. We really are trying to introduce this idea to our funding partners and the same way we do this work on the ground, and that is people in the South often are coming out of really tough and bad situations. There are healing elements that we add to our convenings, to our work. We're actually funding some part of that in our regular grant making. And I think there's a space for us to really reimagine how we build relationships at the national level that are matched by the work we do on the ground so that we can be in community with each other and to really think about it that way. I know folks have grant timelines and other technical things to deal with, but if this work is going to be done effectively in the South, and if we're going to get beyond the institutional and racial barriers that are built into our institutions. How strong is your budget? How strong is your board? And all the technical things that tend to keep resources out of Black and brown communities. We really are going to have to build community and relationship, build some trust, deal with the fact that Southern leaders often need healing in the capacity in which they're operating as they do this work.
So we should be asking the question, how strong are your relationships?
Yes.
All right, so we have questions pouring in from our audience, and I want to go to some of those. We have a question from Lori Villarosa, which many folks know, and she's asking, how are folks on the panel seeing the money flow into the region from national funders? Is that money flowing given the heightened interest in the South? And is it going to new voices? Or is it already going to folks who are experienced and have been doing the work for a while? And is there tension between the two? So let's just talk a little bit about, given the heightened interest we've had in the field around the South, are we seeing an increase in investment to match that interest? And where's that money flowing? Karen, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think that, first of all, I don't think that we're seeing the money flow to match the interest, particularly the initial interest that was shown right after the election. I don't think the amount of interest and the amount of money flowing into the South are equal. But I also still feel like it is not getting to organizations who are on the ground, because many of those organizations are small, they are not necessarily well known, and there is the belief to some extent that small organizations do not know how to manage large sums of money. And so therefore we do that kind of trickle, you know, where we give them a little bit and see if they can do a lot, and then we give them a little bit. But quite honestly, most of them are not getting anything yet. And I would say that if we think we're in a bad place politically now, we should give some thought to where we would be if those small organizations on the ground had not continued to struggle while they were understaffed and underfunded and overworked.
Thank you, Karen. Does anyone else want to talk a little bit? Maybe Fernando, do you want to talk a little bit about, do you think the interest is matching the investment, and where is this money flowing, if it is flowing at all?
If there's money flowing, it's not flowing to the rural South. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, there's been a lot of tables where there's a lot of interest of wanting to fund in the South. And I think then there's a lot of interest of national funders that are trying to figure out how to fund in the South. And I think that's the piece that's missing. And I just really encourage a lot of those national funders to reach out to the local entities like the panelists around this and others that are within the region to start helping to see how we can start working together as partners to get that resources flowing, because I think we need to jump on it. And I think it was mentioned earlier that this is not a short-term thing. We've got to get the money flowing to where it needs, but then also have the conversations to how we're going to keep that money flowing, moving for the long term. But I think the first step needs to take is I think there's got to be some stronger dialogue within national funders or local regional funders to start looking at how we can support each other to get the resources. But to answer the question, no, I don't see the money flowing, especially to the rural South, to where it really needs to take place as of yet.
Right. Thank you.
This is Felicia. I just wanted to add, I agree with Fernando. I think that it's gone from just one drop to perhaps dripping, but flowing is definitely, and I think is an exaggeration. It's definitely not flowing. I think there are a lot of opportunities too. And I do think that we've often heard that we just don't know how to enter in. And to be honest, I don't think it's rocket science. I really think that it just must be some intentional work, and that it has to be a desire to go and do this work. For all the ways that the funding has been made in areas that may not look just like the rural South, but there have been ways that it's been found out that funders have been intentional in doing that. And I think the same can be done in the rural South, but it's just going to take a little more effort. As we talk with some other funders, it's not a one plane ride in for some of our rural communities. You're going to have to maybe take 2 planes, and you may not have a 5-star hotel with room service. And that's not to be said in any way to be offensive, but just a very realistic point.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have another question around civic engagement in Southern communities, independent of elections, national elections. So what are we seeing? What are you all seeing in terms of organizing around civic engagement beyond national elections? Are there examples of coalitions across rural-urban divides that allow individuals in Southern communities to be more involved in self-advocacy on behalf of their communities? So Karen, I'm going to give that question to you and ask Flozell to follow up.
Okay. I want to bring an article to folks' attention that I think was published about 2 weeks ago in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and it directly relates to whether or not we have those bridges between rural and urban communities when it comes down to civic participation. And the article talked about whether or not the rural South was worth saving.
Damn.
Politically, economically, whether or not the rural South was worth saving. And I bring that article up because if you have politicians who are having those kinds of discussions, I think it says something about the way the politics and the economics of the region has been operating. And so that divide between urban and rural is not as coincidental as people may think it is. And so when we talk about doing civic participation and trying to see if we can make that bridge be sustainable, yes, you have organizations out there in the rural South who have partners that would be called urban. And yes, they do participate around civic education and the issues that affect all of us. But I think we all need to understand that even with our politicians in the South, there is a clear divide, an economic and a political divide that we are fighting against when it comes down to rural and urban civic participation, and unifying those two groups.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I think our position and experience is that we're going to be bullish, if I can use that word, on the issue. Knowing and understanding the tremendous odds that we're facing, we've been trying to build the infrastructure that allows us to connect national, regional, and local funders with not only their grantee partners, but with other sectors to achieve the kind of racial equity outcomes that we care about. One example of that more recently was the criminal justice reform legislation recently passed that I mentioned earlier. The truth is, while there was a task force appointed by the governor and powerful people working on these issues, there were hundreds, literally hundreds of people from across Louisiana, from every corner of the state, from New Orleans to rural communities, who found similar interest, who cared about the same thing, and who believed in the power that they had to affect the conversation, to have a media strategy, to come to the Capitol and work on these policy issues and to educate not only themselves, but other members of their community on how they could be helpful. And we saw that move. And one of the most poignant moments that came out of what was hundreds of hours of work and philanthropic investment and strategy work, and in some cases, good old-fashioned civil rights disagreements, was a massive rally, more than 500 people at the Capitol, and folks calling out their hometowns and recognizing that they were from different places, but they were willing to and capable of working on common issues towards a greater outcome. And so we're hoping to mimic that behavior across other mission-critical issues. In Louisiana, for instance, coastal restoration is another one that we're working deeply on. And to Felicia's point, it's not only urban versus rural, it's rural versus rural, it's all kinds of racial and class issues and power dynamics. And we continue to see some real opportunities there.
Great. Thank you. I have another question. This is from an organization that is looking to launch a justice and equity initiative, starting with the lens of racial equity. How do you get the first few foundations to the table and engaged in your work? So I'm going to let Felicia, you take that question for us. So how do you get the first few foundations to the table to begin supporting work that is framed by a racial equity analysis?
Wow, that's a loaded one. I'd say a lot of what we've worked to do is to bring attention to some of the issues that we're working on and to identify funders that we know have an interest in this. And sometimes for some funders that we've worked with, it hasn't automatically been on their radar, but because of their previous work with us and conversations about where we're trying to actually move our community towards the direction we're trying to move our community in, we've gotten some buy-in from them along the way. But I could say what has been most helpful for us is to be able to bring funders to the region to see firsthand what you can't get from reading on a piece of paper. And that is a very challenging part of the work, but we found to be very effective. So engaging them to come and see the existing struggles or opportunities, as you may want to call them, then to discuss the solutions that the communities have crafted to actually make our way out of some of those struggles.
Thank you. Flozell, do you want to talk a little bit about that? This seems like it may be from a nonprofit partner on the line who is really looking at where to begin, who to go to first in trying to fund work that is deeply rooted in a racial justice analysis.
Yeah, part of what we've been doing is we get that call frequently. And so part of what we've been doing is just having the one-on-one, and we really treat it like an advisory opportunity because it's also how we learn about what leadership is emerging in community, what analysis these new organizations have by way of aspiration, and to discuss brass tacks. Do they intend on shaping themselves as a 501c3? Do they want to get a fiscal sponsor? We really try to figure out what's the profile, what's the opportunity, and then to Felicia's point, really try to put them in the matrix of opportunity, if you will, so that when we're talking to funders, both local and national, we can much more deeply express where the talent is, how people are thinking about this, and also, quite frankly, teeing up where funders and other supporters are bringing in capacity building or technical assistance that might be helpful, so we can introduce them and bring them into the pipeline potentially to help them move that work. Set them up with other organizations who might already be doing similar work or who have a similar experience, and take it from that perspective. It often is a great place for us to build a relationship that often goes on to create some fruitful work.
Thank you, Flozell. So that actually helps us segue to a question that we're getting around capacity building and the importance of receiving support for capacity building in addition to project support or even general operating support. So Karen, can you talk a little bit about the kinds of capacity building support that has been useful to your organization and maybe ways in which capacity building support has not been so useful?
Sure, I'll be glad to talk about that. One of the ways that capacity building work has been most useful to the Positive Action Committee is that we determine what capacity building means for us. We do not let foundations tell us, which is kind of what the foundation world is like. It sort of says to organizations, well, we think you're really too small for your staff to be trying to do what you're trying to do. So we want you to build capacity, and we will give you, say, $20,000, $30,000 to build capacity. And what that actually does is end up putting organizations, some of them, in a place where they have now built some capacity that they cannot sustain because the foundation did not fund long enough to sustain that extra staff person or whatever it is that they instructed them to do to build their capacity. And I have to tell you, I'm a little wary of the term capacity building. Whose capacity and for what, and how is it going to be sustained, and who determines what's appropriate and what is not. So for us, capacity building is we lay out in our proposal what we need to do, what we're trying to do. And if you really want to help us build capacity, then fund that, because we know what we ask for. We know why we ask for it. So fund that. And organizations, particularly small organizations, many of them went under during the so-called recession, when wealthy foundations were afraid that they might get, $10 less wealthier. And so they pulled out a lot of money. And because they had already gotten many of these organizations into this capacity building mode, where they went from 3 staff people to 6 staff people, when they went into that recession mode, those organizations went under. There are a number of organizations in the South, community-based rural organizations, that went under because they had been lured into some kind of false capacity building that the philanthropic world was then not willing to sustain. So that's why when we talk about capacity building with groups, we talk to them very clearly about what is it that you all see your capacity as needing to be, and how do you then get that funded. And I think we need to be very clear. It is not better to have a small organization, have 6 people on staff, all of them be poorly paid, all of them have no benefits, all of them be working themselves to death. That model of capacity building is not better than an organization that says we need 3 people on staff, we need them well paid, we need their benefits and their retirements and all of that taken care of. So the one thing I would say is that groups need to determine what their own capacity build efforts look like, and they need to ask to get those funded, and they do not need to have someone determine that for them.
Thank you, Karen. Fernando, I want to get you in on this conversation around capacity building. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of capacity building you all do with your grantees, and what kind of capacity building you all receive that is useful to Southern Partners Fund?
I mean, I have to go right along with what Karen was just talking about. We do the capacity building work specifically around the needs of the organization. We let that guide the work of the capacity. But I think part of it, and I think as we're talking about national funders and support around capacity building as well, is that we also, through the Social Justice Institute, the network of leadership and consultants and trainers that we have built within that are all Southern leaders that have they're based in the South. They understand the issues of the South, where they go and work with these organizations in their work around capacity building and building the capacity of the organizations and where their needs are. And that's one of the things that's always challenging when we go after getting capacity building support, is that a lot of national funders want us to use their consultants, their leaders, and bring them to the South, which beyond in reality, our grantees and our partners within the region just do not feel comfortable working with, because they walk away with nothing, and that's the way they put it, because they feel that they're learning or wanting to be taught by somebody that doesn't have an understanding of the region. And that's one of the reasons that, when we developed the Social Justice Institute, that our network of consultants that we work with are all from the region. And any capacity building monies that we receive as a part of it, we make sure that we utilize that leadership to make sure that there's a more effective outcome for the organizations that are needing, and to be more effective in that process.
Thank you, Fernando. All right, we have 2 more questions I want to try and squeeze in here before we run out of time. And so, Flozell, we just celebrated a huge win here in Louisiana, a 10% reduction in our state prison population over the next 10 years. And we know that that work was an effort that really was both about connecting grassroots organizing with sort of grass tops to sort of move that to state policy. So can you talk a little bit around what that looks like, what opportunities there are to align grassroots partners with Grasstop's efforts to move state policy? How is this working? And what has kept such efforts from being effective in the past?
Yeah, I think what made the difference this time, to some degree, are resources that allowed grassroots organizations and people with experience, right? Whether it's family of those incarcerated or their loved ones or other folks who care about these issues, faith communities and others, to really have a space to create their own strategies, to bring their narrative to the conversation and make sure that there is a connection between the work that they were doing and the work that so-called Grasstop's elected and appointed leaders were doing. So what we saw, in fact, by way of philanthropic support and civic leadership, are grassroots organizations shaping their own set of policies and strategies. One of the things that Karen or someone mentioned is we assume that grassroots communities don't have the wisdom and the talent to do that. We, in fact, saw some of the most sophisticated policy recommendations and suggestions come out of community. And then we created space using the leverage of philanthropy to be able to get into a more privileged spaces, if you will, to make those connections, make sure their recommendations were heard, to ensure that the civic engagement strategies deployed throughout the process made space for them to get time, not only with the decision makers, but with media so that they can begin to reshape the narrative, create a different scale of impact, and then begin to move that work. And so to be honest with you, in some ways, it put grassroots communities, real community members on the same footing as some of our more nefarious opponents like district attorneys and others who typically have a very significant bully pulpit and a way to overexpress their positions on these things. In many ways, that created more balance in the conversation. It drove and gave support to Grasstop's leaders who were interested in moving a change agenda, but quite frankly thought there would be a political price to pay. They were able to get some cover from grassroots communities back home, both in rural communities and urban communities from North Louisiana to South Louisiana. And that, I believe, made the change.
Thank you, Flozell. So I have this one last question I want to squeeze in there. And Fernando, I want to ask you, because you all are working regionally across the region. So as the Latinx community grows here in the South, what's the landscape for funding this work? What does that look like? Folks are talking about having a really hard time convincing folks that we need to band together to create philanthropic ventures to direct funds towards this growing community in our region. So can you talk about that from a regional perspective, about the growth of the Latinx community and what efforts are there to support the growth and really the organizing of this community?
Well, I think there's a lot that needs to happen to support the Latino community across the region. I mean, it is growing tremendously, and it's growing not even just in urban areas, but all across the region as a part of it. But I mean, getting support to support the work of the immigrant community is something that's very challenging. Again, as I mentioned, through our Southern organizing strategy, 60% of our grant making dollars is around that, being one of the three issue areas around immigration reform and immigration rights, immigrant rights as a part of it. But getting support for that work is something that's very challenging. I think it's something that needs to be strengthened. I think it's something that needs to continue to be supported and supported at a higher level from funders as a part of it. And I think we're looking, and we're always continuing looking for partners, the regional partners, national partners, local partners, community partners, any partnership to strengthen and leverage any dollars to support any social issue as a part of it. But the Latino community as a whole, there is a big need for that process.
All right. So thank you guys so much, and thank our audience for these fantastic questions. I am going to just get a round of closing thoughts and a real call to action from our amazing speakers. So beginning back at the beginning with you, Felicia, can you talk a little bit about what you have learned doing your work in the South about working and winning in a hostile political environment? What's one lesson you are holding on to in this moment that you would like to share with our national colleagues? Felicia?
She's on.
All right, well, Flozell, you go ahead and answer that question, and we'll come back to Felicia right after you're finished.
There she is. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I was at a conference not long ago, and I heard a lady sum it up very well, and she talked about in the culture of organizations approaching funders, most oftentimes, well, one of the greatest lessons to learn is to approach them standing tall and not on our knees. And I take that along with me in all the work that I do, because so oftentimes we're made to almost be ashamed or to apologize for, as Karen eloquently put it earlier, for needing what we need to do the work that we know needs to be done. So the piece that I carry with me is that I don't apologize for the way we do our work, for what is needed to do our work and to do it well. And I also don't apologizing for wanting to have the value of what needs to be done. So not to shortchange the work that needs to be done because the resources aren't there. So I don't go on my knees, but I definitely go standing, and I stand a lot taller because community is holding me up.
Thank you, Felicia. Fernando, would you end along those same lines? What are you holding on to in this moment as someone who has been working and winning in this region? What can you share with our national partners?
I think the key piece is fund the work that needs to happen and led by community. I mean, I think that's the biggest piece. Make sure that we're funding the work the community is guiding and leading, and is stating that needs to happen as a part of the process, instead of coming in with an outside agenda saying this is what's going to happen. I think funding the work that is led by community is the key piece. And then also what was mentioned earlier, it's a long-term investment. It's not something that's going to be taken, change is not going to happen overnight. I mean, it's really getting that long-term investment from national funders to support the work that needs to happen here in the South.
Thank you. Fernando, what are you holding on to about working, that you've learned from working and winning here in the region?
Did you mean me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a lot to say, but I'll be honest with you. I've been thinking a lot in the last year for so many different reasons about this notion of joy and justice. And I'm really holding on to the fact that I love the South. The South has been good to me. The South is full of beautiful and amazing people, and there is an extraordinary reason for investment to be made in those people. We really do have, I think, the ability to unlock answers and to create a space for us to lead the nation and what it means to create justice-filled and joyful communities. I believe that the work that we've been blessed to do across the board of this panel and many others is an example of that. And we're hoping that our investment partners can see the opportunity in the joy and justice.
Thank you, Flozell. And last but not least, Karen, talk a little bit about what you're holding on to in this moment that you really can share with our national partners that the South has taught you that you think may benefit the work that they're doing now.
Sure. For the local organizations on the ground, I would share, stand fast on your strategies and on what you believe you need to be doing, and do not be swayed by what the philanthropic world is funding or what has become the new baby of the year. Live and do the work that you knew you got into this to do, and stay firm on that. And even if it means that you have to work with very little funding sometimes, still stay committed to that work, because you're putting yourselves on the line for that work. And if you're going to be putting yourselves and your families on the line, it needs to be your agenda and not some agenda that somebody gave to you. That's what I would say for local organizations. And for national funders, what I would say to them is, make sure that you are funding social justice work because you believe in social justice, and not because you believe in the charity of social justice. Because if you really believe in social justice, then you will treat the people you are funding the same way you try and treat yourselves are the people who work in your foundation offices. But if you are funding because of the charity of it, then you will continue to do that. Hand out little by little, let me tell you what you need to do, because that looks very much like the very same world of oppression that we are fighting.
Thank you so much, Karen. And so with that, I'd like to close our panel. I just want to say thank you, Felicia, Fernando, Flozell, and Karen, for being my colleagues, for doing the work that you do here in the South, and for just being amazing human beings. And so with that, I'm going to turn it right back over to Caitlin and NCRP. Thank you for having me.
Thank you
so
for
much.
the work you did here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Takima, to Felicia, Fernando, Karen, and Flozell, and also to our co-hosts. This was a rich discussion, and we hope you all got a lot out of it and have a lot to follow up on after this. If this is your first time interacting with NCRP, we are a research and advocacy organization working to benefit advance philanthropy that benefits underserved communities and systems change, and we want to support your work. We invite you to stay engaged with us. Join NCRP in our movement to transform philanthropy, either as a nonprofit member or a foundation supporter. Next week, you'll be receiving a follow-up email with a list of resources, including a webinar recording and a summary blog post and some of the things that the speakers have mentioned on the call today. Make sure to stay tuned for the next As the South Grows report that'll be coming out on June 26th. And please fill out the webinar survey that will appear on your screen. So thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.